I was thinking about fiction and its role. So obviously there's Rand's view, which makes sense to me, of the fiction embodying abstractions and helping to guide your thoughts.
Yeah.
And then fiction for, like, when you study philosophy, it's often, I feel it's so easy for there to remain a disconnect between the intellect and who you are as a person. And so
Yes.
do you think in a way fiction is filling that role as well? It gives you the menu. Obviously you need to extract away what parts of this character are an application of this principle, but it gives you options for how to think about what you want to become, rather than just as an intellectual exercise. Like you need,
Yes.
obviously, yeah. Okay, cool.
I think Rand does argue that point. I don't
Yeah,
know which essay in particular, but that
yeah,
is very much her view. I mean, that
right.
is not merely the cognitive role, but also this more existential thing.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm onto something there for sure.
Yeah.
What do you think the role of memorization is in philosophy? So, for example, right now I told you I'm studying the history of philosophy. There are so many facts in there, and you can go through it and go, oh, okay, that's why that happened. But then, 2 weeks later, you forget it, and it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to. Yeah, you just forget it, and then it becomes like another useless fact. And so I wrote this up, and I want to get your thoughts on it.
Um, I think it's more a matter of the way you think in principles. Thinking in principles does aid your memory in a way that it would seem that if you're thinking in principles, you remember things well.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that really helps your question.
Right.
I mean, to some extent, yes, you got to memorize because you can't look everything up all the time.
Yeah.
You can't just look it up to know it. But fortunately, thinking in principles is a way to memorize things that if if you think in principles, it will get remembered better. There's no
Right.
special technique. It's just when you think in principles, you remember things better. And I know, at least incidentally, Rand, people said she had a really good memory. She can remember things very well, even things in her life.
Right.
And she did say she always tried to think in principles from early on in life. Whether or not she was accurate was beside the point, but that she put in effort to think in principle, it seems, related to her ability to remember. Even what I
Right.
do in psychology would point to the idea that principles or thinking in essentials or reducing what you have to think about at once is essential. And the way you organize your ideas is essential how you remember them.
It could be the case that it's the other way too, as in if you have a good memory and you at least make a lot of effort to memorize, that is what helps you to then form the
Right,
principles and make the connections. The reason I even
right.
brought this up in the first place is I've experimented with memorizing some philosophical ideas from using Anki.
Yeah,
And I found that what happens is, obviously, like, I do think that one of the most important elements is the conceptual understanding, the integration and the concretizations. And I do a lot of that with you. I'm like asking questions and trying to
yeah,
understand things. But memory still seems to play a role. And the reason, yeah, like I said, the reason I bring this up is I was going through an Anki deck and I was thinking about something that Peikoff was talking about. So he was talking about history, the history of philosophy being an analogy for, a kind of philosophical psychoanalysis of Western civilization.
yes,
And I made a connection to something completely random in a book I read in 1984, which we'll go over. And I started making other connections as well, but I wouldn't have made those connections if I didn't have that in memory and I wasn't actively trying to recall it. And if I permanently had an amazing memory, I could see myself making way more connections. But because I don't, it does seem like an actual active, conscious attempt at memorization may play an important part. I even brought up in this little paragraph I wrote here. So Atlas Shrugged let's say you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra or Musashi or Les Miserables, and you're inspired, what difference does it make if you forget a lot of the scenes that made you cry, why they made you cry, and what the meaning was? Like, you can forget that stuff. I do a lot.
Yeah, I think what I would say is, well, so what I'm saying, I'm taking for granted that I can demonstrate to you the why scientifically I think so, these certain specific things. So, but in general, I could say yes, there's no such thing as just having a good or bad memory. It's the way in which you apply, the way you organize your thoughts. It's the way in which you focus on different things that contributes to whether you have good memory, which you could say there's certain things you're good at doing that leads to good memory, but you can always learn to have a good memory. Even the people with the best memories in the world, say the people who can count to pi up to like 5,000 numbers, they have no special memory skill. Rather, they use a particular method to then be able to easily recall the numbers. It's not some genius skill. You can train anybody with it. And maybe there are some aspects that are inborn, but you can train it very well. And part of that includes like bringing the methods you use to bring focus onto different things you want to remember. It's all about how you organize what you want to remember.
I'm suspicious. I think that you can use the methods. I know there are, I consider them tricks still. I'm open to exploring them more, but tricks as in to memorize a deck or to memorize numbers with using mnemonics as substitutes is not the same as someone who reads a book and remembers many different scenes and then reflects on that book and what happened and then makes additional connections to not have knowledge they have, if you know what I'm saying. I find it, for me, I'm often, when I'm making efforts to memorize like I have recently, it's only then that I start making the connections. But before I memorize, I don't seem to be able to make them, if that makes sense.
I think so. I mean, there is a lot to say about that, but I mean, what I can say, at least, I think you would agree that at least principles or essentials help you organize things. That if you have things you want to remember, at least organize in some way, whether you want to use mnemonics or whether you want to use like draw a chart or like a diagram, like when we did like the genus differentia. Remember that? That list of like, we broke up the concept and reduced it to, I think, the axioms.
Oh yeah, and you did. I remember, and we did great. Yeah. And we were arguing over if it's grasp or not grasp. Yeah.
And that would be a way of, I don't know, diagramming your thoughts and things like that generally help you recognize relationships. And that should help with memory as well. That's kind of what I mean by the way you organize your ideas.
Okay. What about if you, okay, maybe we'll go over this later. I'm experimenting with this, memorizing parts of the history of philosophy lecture. And then as I read through Nietzsche or Aristotle, I want to see if it helps me or not. So.
Yeah. And like, do you remember what people call the Feynman method? Like Richard Feynman said, the best way to learn to memorize is like teach to others, or at least explain what you learned to others.
That's why I run my groups. That's why I run those groups.
That's a big step for memorization.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, cool.
It's because you're bringing your mind to focus on that repeatedly. So then it just becomes more easily accessed.
Right. And you're asked questions that challenge you.
So you could expand your understanding as well.
Yeah. I found this in 1984 and I completely forgot about it. I remember reading it and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I only made this connection later to the concrete bound mentality and also to the study of history. And so I'm bringing this up from two different angles. So one is, obviously, this is an example of the concrete bound mentality. It's a concretization that, interestingly enough, it was made by by George Orwell in 1984. And then also from the, I'm looking at it also from the angle of studying history. So this is a scene, and I've bolded what's relevant, and I can tell you, it's pretty long, but basically in the first paragraph, you can see that what the context is, Winston, who's the character, the main character in this book, is trying to find someone who can tell him what it was like before the revolution, what it was like before Big Brother took over. And he ends up in this bar. He finds this really old guy, and he ends up in this bar, and he starts talking to this guy. And here's the first paragraph. So he asks him about what life was like before the revolution. And this guy starts going on about, once one of them pushed me. I recollected it. It was at some boat race. He was pushed, and he starts going on about a guy zigzagging across the pavement, and I bumps into him accidental like, and he keeps on going about this incident where he was bumped into.
Yeah.
And then it says here, a sense of helplessness took hold of Winston. The old man's memory was nothing but a rubbish heap of details.
Yep.
One could question him all day without getting real information. And he tries again. All right, what I'm trying to say is this. You've been alive for a very long time. You've lived all your life before the revolution. In 1925, for instance, you're already grown up. What would you say from what you can remember that life in 1925 was better than it is now or worse? If you could choose, would you prefer to live now and then? And then he launches again into, if you want to read this, he just launches into this crap again.
Yeah. It's just terrible reasoning, but also very concrete bound. Yeah.
Yeah, I suffer. He starts talking about his bladder and then about women. It just makes no sense. And then Winston is completely deflated by this point. And he says, the guy, like this is the final paragraph here.
Yeah, I get the idea.
Yeah, cool. So, okay, so one is, this is a concretization of the concrete bound mentality. But then if you're looking at it, if we're making comparisons between studying history in philosophy and studying history in any other field, including psychology or the psychology of a patient, in a way, for example, if you're studying the psychology of a patient, it doesn't make sense to study the history of a patient in the same way as you would study the history of philosophy, right? It's sort of a return to what we discussed earlier, because what if someone's like this? You don't know if any of this is relevant to his life or not.
Well, if you're treating him as a patient, I would first think, what led him to think in this word salad kind of way? Does he have a mental disorder? Is because I would almost wonder, does he have early stages of dementia? Because it makes no sense.
Right.
It's just like nonsense, non sequiturs all over the place.
Okay.
But then you could probably eventually see that, well, if it's not mental illness, it could be a result of this terrible way of thinking. I mean, that's all I would say is taking into account their history. See, how did they get here? I mean, you could just take it for granted, well, they're this way now, and how do I deal with it? But sometimes knowing how they got there is a way to fix what the problem was, or to discover what was their particular problem. I mean, maybe it was something dumb, like there's some infection they got which affected the brain, and they imagine they take a medication that goes away. I mean, that's something you can only find out by looking at their history, but at some point you'll discover that really it's something usually more essential. Usually it's something like the philosophy led to with some way of thinking, not usually merely some infection. Like you can find that there's something broader at work, and you probably can only discover that by looking at their history, like maybe like process of elimination, or find other additional factors that might explain even more about how they got here. Because you can't take things in a vacuum. I mean, things become a certain way. They don't just merely exist this way eternally. They change and evolve. So you have to take that into account.
Right. And yeah, like the revisionist argument about history is something like history is a tool which you can use to hurt other people. And also they make a valid point, which is often studying history is subjective because out of all the facts you need to select, just like this guy is selecting facts, out of all the facts you need to select, you're often going to select them subjectively, simply by how you feel, what strikes you as relevant at the time. And so you could say the revisionist view of history sort of applies to this guy, right? Or any person you speak with and ask about their history. Like, it depends on the person and how their method of thinking. But
Yes.
often it is true that out of the plethora of facts, you cannot be, well, it's not that you cannot be objective, but most people won't be objective. They're going to necessarily subjectively pick out these facts, which may or may not be essential in their development as people.
Yeah.
So
I think the difference with, I guess, history of philosophy is that there's usually more recorded things for that, because what we define as philosophy would be the written down things.
Right.
Of course, there is ambiguity because we don't have everything Aristotle wrote.
Right.
We don't have everything Plato wrote.
Right.
There's really other Greeks we don't know about.
Right.
And who knows what else.
Because they were heathens.
So there's still problems. But
okay.
But you're right, it's very difficult because some of it is just testimony. A lot of it we know about ancient Rome is just what somebody said about it, not because somebody saw it. You have no video, so what can you do? Caesar wrote about his trip to France, but is that everything that happened? Did he make some things up? Probably.
Or even if he didn't make stuff up, was it stuff that was important and relevant?
Yeah, maybe he just left some things out or failed to emphasize something else.
Right.
Or somebody else was at a different part in the battle and they saw something additional that he did not.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I think we did say this earlier, that one of the differences between this problem or trap and studying the history of philosophy is that we do have a written record of ideas specifically, and we know what we're looking for. We're looking for the questions people asked and the answers they gave, right? So it's kind of different from trying to get an account of what was important to you at the time.
Yeah, it's easier at least. Not that it's easy, but it's just not as hard.
Right. All right, I got one more thing for you. I'll explain this in a second. All right, thoughts before I go into questions?
I didn't hear any sound though.
Oh, you didn't get sound.
I thought it was buffering or something, so I didn't say anything.
I wonder how do I,
I could just look it up. Can I look it up on YouTube?
It's not on YouTube. I made this clip for you. So if you go to this, you've got access to this file. So if I put this in chat.
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay.
Which is better. There we go. Is he reading something?
No. It's part of a wide context. The context is a conversation about language and conversation.
I literally couldn't follow.
Okay.
Like, let me try again. Was it clear to you?
maybe it's too out of context. It's too out
Let
of
me
context to clip. I
let me
was going
give
to
it
make some
one more
connections and ask you.
one
Yeah. Okay.
second. I'll give it
Okay.
one more
Cool.
try. Okay, I got it now.
Okay.
His
Cool.
accent confused me a bit, but I get it
Right.
now.
Right.
I got it now.
Thoughts before I go into. I'm
Um,
trying to make some connections here, and that's why I brought this video up. But I'll open up my question pad in a second after I get whatever you think.
so things get lost in translation when you put it in English, but also what English cannot say. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's true
That's
to an
true.
extent, only in the sense that strictly if you translate, you don't capture everything. You have to sometimes add additional words if you need to capture those additional
Yeah.
words that English isn't expressing in the same way, or English would express in a radically different way. So it's hard to cross the barrier sometimes in translation, unless you learn the other language as well.
I'm mainly focused on the unsaid. Him
Okay.
saying that the unsaid is what's interesting.
The unsaid. I mean, there's a lot of connotation in words that when you say one word, you instantly visualize something generally, and you can't necessarily just give that to somebody. Like if you say the word, I don't know, broccoli, whatever you picture immediately is something that would only be unique to the way you think of that language.
Right.
Okay. And what's not said would be, say, the things you might think of that you don't even put in the translation, but nonetheless you think of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that was different than what I was thinking about. The reason I brought it up is because so that was part of a group that I used to join.
Yeah.
It was just some random person commenting in the discussion, but
yeah,
the reason why I brought it up is because he mentioned Lacan, this philosopher who I know nothing about, but I found it interesting because I remember having a conversation with a friend, and she's doing a doctorate in psychology, and she's practicing, and she also studies psychoanalysis. And at one point she brought up to me, what's important is what is not said. It's the not that is said. And it's what's unsaid in the conversation that's important. And I thought, hang on a second, is there some relationship here between what she's going on about, what she's learning about in psychoanalysis, and what this guy is saying about Lacan and the unsaid?
Probably Lacan is a psychoanalyst.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yes.
Right. Like that's interesting.
That's why.
But do you think there's some, without having more context? So I guess I could mention something she mentions. She said something like, when a patient comes in and discusses their problem, if they don't talk about their mother, that's important. Or if they don't talk about something else, that's important. And I found it quite bizarre, like bizarre in the sense that it might or it might not. They haven't said anything about it. So what can you say really? And I was wondering if there was a connection there to philosophy. Maybe there's like this her psychoanalytic school was influenced by this. And then, this guy's obviously talking about what's not said. Because, in a sense, like there's a pen right now next to me. That's unsaid,
Yeah.
But is it relevant?
Well, in a way, what you say is identifying what you think is important or essential. And if you don't say something else, well, you think the other thing is not essential. You could say either you're evading the other thing and know that it's essential, but won't talk about it, or you've made a mistake and think this is essential when what you have not said is what was essential. That if somebody doesn't mention their mother, but psychoanalysis thinks their mother is essential, they'll say the fact that you didn't bring her up is indicative of, say, avoiding your mother or something like that, that it would indicate something about what you think.
Do you think this could be a case of reifying zero?
I think sometimes it can be.
Yeah, okay. All right. I was just trying to make a connection there because I found it interesting that I didn't make that. I didn't know what she was talking about. It just seemed bizarre to me. Like it didn't make sense. But then I heard this guy speak and I thought, oh, okay, wow. So maybe there's a connection to philosophy here, like this whole thing about what is not said.
Yeah. So I would also point out that Freud himself had some influence by Nietzsche. So Nietzsche even has some connection to this.
Right. Okay.
And Carl Jung.
Wow. Okay. So, okay.
Carl
Interesting.
Jung loved Nietzsche. Like Jung loved Nietzsche. Like he's like worked straight from Nietzsche to get his ideas.
Wow. I didn't know that. Very interesting. Did Nietzsche say something about transforming your jealousy or envy as well?
I would guess, but I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. I can skip that. I was just curious if there was more there. I guess I was excited by that because I thought, oh, cool. There's like, here's an example of another case where someone is suddenly going into, like, she's training as a therapist and suddenly all these things she's doing are influenced by philosophers.
Yes.
They're looking for the unsaid, the zero that is not a zero.
Yeah. Psychoanalysis is almost in a way an aspect of philosophy, although I would think it's pretty wrong on many levels. I understand at least where it's coming from.
Right. All right, next question is about the questions that act as a philosophical barometer of the culture, which is in Mr. Peikoff's words.
Yes.
And he provided these three questions.
Yeah.
I was curious. I don't know if you're going to know some of these questions because they're probably very history of philosophy oriented. Like, how does he even get to them? And then also, what do they mean? And then, yeah, I've got more questions about it, but yeah, just sort of preliminary thoughts. Like, how do you get to these questions?
I'm not sure how he would have developed those specifically. I mean, they seem to follow from things Rand would say, but I don't know exactly what his argument would be. They're consistent. They don't make me think, oh, what does that mean at all? I have some idea. Like, what do they think is realistic? Well, what people think about reality affects many things about their behavior. And if you do that on a wide scale, well, that's a culture. I mean, really, it's just saying, what do they think about their life? He just broke it down into more pieces. What do they think is real? What do they believe? And what is important? In a way, it looks like you split into like metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical. Like,
oh,
what
okay,
do you regard as
interesting.
human? What's human? Like, what matters to us? What do you regard as certain? What do you know? What do you think is realistic? What exists in reality?
Oh, okay. How do I? Yeah, I guess so. Those are the. So I had a question about what kinds of aspects of different cultures does one observe to answer these questions. I guess it's that, but it's not like, you know, if I study ancient Greece, this is necessarily presented to me. Here's what they thought was realistic.
Yes.
Here's what they thought was certain.
Right.
Here's what they thought was human. I guess it's all implicit, and I don't find it particularly easy to, like, okay, even look at today. Well, I don't know what people find realistic. What do they regard as certain? I'm not sure. What do they regard as human? I'm also not sure. Like, unless someone gives me a nice pre-made cake with all this inside, it's very hard for me to ask those questions and find answers in a culture. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think you just have to think like an anthropologist. Nietzsche tried to do that, at least with the ancient Greeks. He's like, well, what did this Dionysian Apollo dichotomy? Like, he thought that was like a certain Greek way of thinking, and that expressed their type of culture, whether it was irrational or not. expressed whatever it was. That even what
Right.
they thought about the gods reflected what they thought about themselves even.
Okay. Okay, well,
I don't
maybe
think,
for realistic, could I say something like going to the moon is realistic? Is that because that's for our culture? I know that's very much more concrete bound, but I'm just trying to get somewhere in on these questions.
probably. I mean, in one sense, you could say, is it realistic? As in, is it, do you have the technology versus could it ever be done in any way? Or if you think, could you make a conscious robot? Some people might say that's impossible by the nature
Okay.
of reality. Others might
Yeah.
say, sure, we could if we have the
Right.
technology. I think
Right.
that'd be an example.
Okay. And then what about if you had to think about today, what do people regard as certain? What's like what would I extract out of today's culture with that question?
Um,
Because I
what do
don't
you mean?
know how to answer that.
Um,
It's not like, I guess I'm like a student who wants the answer key here. Like what it's not like someone has canvassed all these different cultures and said, here are the answers to these questions.
I mean,
That's what I'm looking for, but I don't have
we
the
could
answers.
say that we can expect with almost certainty that the government will violate rights in some way. Like that's not even like, I mean, that reflects the culture. If you can expect, say that,
Okay.
I don't know, if your representatives will never listen to you,
Yeah.
then even if it's not like, it could be certain in the sense that we can't really expect anything else other than
Yeah.
they'll fail us or something like that. Even if you are have a great way of thinking, if that's the way the world works, it's like, well, it's almost like a pessimism about the world, but it's true. Even you can't just make everything to utopia. You could acknowledge that something bad exists and you can't do anything about, and that could be bad too. Like, say legalizing drugs, could say like, it's certain that cocaine is probably going to be illegal forever, even if it shouldn't be. And if you regard that as a certain thing, then it could be reflect something about whether you think government could ever be good, or it could reflect about just distrust in the government, which then could reflect what type of culture there is. Like, does anyone respect the government, or does anybody have regard for each other? Questions like that. It influences that.
Okay. What about if we're on the topic of politics, then would you say if when people in a way they think it's certain, they're certain about government, the role of government, I would say they almost have like a view of government that's closer to Rousseau's, so the social contract theory, where
Yeah.
in order to live in a good culture, the government needs to take taxes. And if either you're in that or too bad, you should go live on an island if you don't believe in that. So would you say that's more about human or about certainty?
I guess a
More
bit of
about like
both.
what kind of, yeah.
Bit of both. I
Okay.
mean, you could say, I think it's inevitable that the government will do this today because the government isn't properly formed. So of course it's going to do that. But if you don't regard that your government can act functionally or can act properly, then you could have like a certain pessimism about where you live, that maybe an expectation that because everyone else is irrational, that it affects you in some level, that you can't, that it contributes to the culture as a whole. Like,
Well,
it's hard to make this point, I think. I'm trying to say that you could be sure of something without being like a metaphysical necessity. It depends on the choices everyone makes.
I'm okay. Maybe we'll put this on. We'll put it on pause, and we can.
Okay.
I can revisit it when I've gone
Yeah.
through all the history of philosophy lectures.
Yeah.
Because I don't. Maybe he'll give more examples, but right now I'm not really able to make
Okay.
much of this.
Sure.
All right. This was another point he made about why would you reconstruct the history of the Western the philosophical history of the Western world.
Yeah.
And he said there's 3 questions it helps you answer. So one is, what are the root errors of today? Why did the errors develop? How do they clash with good premises? Doesn't this already assume you've identified the errors? Like, you're already at a point where, okay, this is an error, here's the truth, and now let's look at history. So isn't that kind of, it's not like it helps you identify the errors, because you must have already identified them, right?
I don't think so. I mean, studying it will help you to discover what they are. I mean, I don't see why it's necessarily the case you already know them. I mean, if you already know them, sure, there would be almost no point. But I think he's saying that you can only find out what the roots are, or what even the errors are. Oh, let me parse that a different way. There are certain errors we know about, but what are the root of those errors that we have identified? Right. What led to them? So and partially, yes, you're right that sometimes you've already identified an error. You're just looking at the origin of it. In another sense, you could still analyze the different instances of a certain idea, then notice something in common, recognize that as an error, then unify those together, then find the common origin among all those errors.
Okay. Well, I'm still not, I'm going to wait before because maybe, I'm only up to like lecture 5 or something, but it's still not clear why context matters, why the context for an error matters that much. That's
it'll
all
probably become clear when you get more towards the Renaissance. Because then you have more examples of why the history as a whole makes a difference. Yeah.
Okay. And then, when we're talking about errors clashing with good premises, do you think one of the points that we want to see over time in different cultures, how they interact, as opposed to just how they interact today?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, like, you could say that history developed differently through Western Europe versus the Byzantine Empire after the fall of Rome. Very different progress. Like all the Arabic investigation to Aristotle versus almost absent investigation in Western Europe for hundreds of years until Aquinas.
Right. Okay. Okay, next question. If you want to read it, and then we can discuss. Does it ever make sense to speak of a two-way causal relationship? I guess that's where I'm getting with this. And this is based on, let me know when you read it and I'll give more context.
Yeah. Was that from Peikoff?
No, this is my formulation, but it's based on his explanation of why philosophy developed in ancient Greece, which part of it, he said, was comparative political freedom, as opposed to those other cultures which had less political freedom. But then he said, and I took this to be the most important, I'm not sure if this is right, but their religion was unusual in that, they had anthropomorphic gods. It was more this worldly orientated. Therefore, you're not stuck in a prison. So you're more interested in learning about the world. Knowledge is, it's the world is a good place. Knowledge is valuable. And you develop this kind of attitude that you might not in a culture orientated towards another dimension like the ancient Egyptians. But then, we say, okay, philosophy is the root of all modern scientific fields, and it's the soil of the culture. But in this case, it's like philosophy developed from the culture. So I'm trying to get my head around it being like, okay, so philosophy develops in the culture, but it's also the root of the culture. I'm just getting my head around that.
It's like a feedback loop. I mean, you could say that let me think of an example really quick.
It's like a chicken and egg type thing. Like, okay, so what comes first actually?
they feed into each other. I mean, I could say that much. That you could say that the soil causes a plant to grow. No, that's a bad example.
Maybe I'm, what's it called when you switch meanings of words?
Equivocation.
Yeah, maybe I'm equivocating. And in this case, because he talked about the religion of the Greek culture being unusual. So maybe the religion is the fundamental, and the religion, in a sense, is an implicit philosophy. Could I get away with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all culture, some aspect of something about culture is always philosophy, but not
Okay.
all things about culture are philosophy, I would say. Like parts of culture cause philosophy, and philosophy causes parts of culture. I would rather say it that way. I mean, that would make more sense to me because we could say a culture could include language, and language isn't, well, philosophy
And
doesn't
writing.
cause your language necessarily. I mean, there could be some minor influence, but ancient Greek isn't the way it is because of their philosophy. I mean, that's uncommon across all cultures, even Egyptian and everyone else. So in that sense, culture would not be related, and nor would philosophy would go either direction. But as far as religion, philosophy, science, and government and traditions, those I think generally go in line with philosophy. And they would influence each other because the more you develop your religion, the more your philosophy develops, and the more the philosophy develops, the more religion develops, or the more that science develops, the more that philosophy develops, and vice versa, because they feed into each other.
I'm just putting down the characteristics of culture, and I'm trying to, okay, so then we say this is the fundamental, and actually we can go about that.
Yeah. I think science follows from that as well, in government,
I would
but
say,
not language.
but so just in terms of what's it called? Like looking, obviously we're listing characteristics, but we're trying to go in a hierarchy. So this, then this, yeah?
Yeah. Or we might say
Okay.
even mythology instead of religion. It just depends on you, your preferred word.
Okay. Okay,
I
so
like
do
mythology.
you think this then solves my question? Because I'm saying, well, I mean, there's two aspects to this question. One, can you actually have two things cause each other?
Yes,
That doesn't seem right. You can.
that's harder to demonstrate, but I think
Yeah.
that's important in things we say there's a unity between things. Like the purpose of life is life. Like it might seem circular, but they depend on each other. Or the reason, purpose, and self-esteem. You can't divorce them from each other. Or at least that's the take I take on with Rand. That you
Right.
unify these things. Mind and body have to be unified. That you can't say body causes mind or mind causes body. They're part of each other. They can cause each other in a way. It depends how you construct the argument, but it is possible to do. It's not invalid as long as you, depends on your analysis though. You have to demonstrate in a way that they're part of each other.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to argue, but
It's because the claim is that philosophy is fundamental. It doesn't mean
right.
philosophy, like I heard this in an interview, that philosophy doesn't make a Da Vinci, but it allows a Da Vinci to exist, for example, or a Michelangelo to exist. That's what I heard,
Right.
but it's not something I've personally validated. So
I mean, philosophy cause, I mean, we can almost say religion mythology is philosophy and just say it has bearing on government, technology, and traditions primarily.
okay, so we'll go with that. I think
You
that
probably can
kind of
combine religion
makes
into
sense.
philosophy anyway.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna revisit that one, but
But I would definitely split up the other aspects. You can't say that philosophy causes food and drinking. Not really. It'd be silly to think that.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
But it's not a strict breakdown.
Well, actually, you might say
Sometimes.
like, what about people drinking ayahuasca in a rainforest?
Sure, I mean, maybe it'd be closer, above language.
Yeah.
And above traditions, but below science and technology in terms of essentialness or importance.
Oh, I forgot something else important. I forgot art.
Art would probably be above government even, I would bet.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Or at least this is a way to make it easier to analyze what Peikoff is talking about. When you break things down into different portions, you break down philosophy, you break down culture.
Out of curiosity, how would you, so these are characteristics, but then what would be a definition? Like, culture is such a vague, I've heard that thrown around. I've never had a good sense of it until I got some of these characteristics, but then this is not a definition. This is just.
Yeah, you need genus differentia.
Yeah.
How would I do it?
I know what Ayn Rand's is, but that's just stealing hers. So I don't.
A collection of beliefs that relate a group of people, a large group of people, something like that. I mean, that's my first pass. It's not good enough, but that's the first pass.
Yeah. Okay. So, questions of epistemology. Okay, so he talked about what are the questions of epistemology. I quite liked his little. I always laugh. I love that I laugh so much when I'm listening to him. But he said this, and I'm concerned with just the bolded aspect. And then also maybe some of this we can wrap up with that, I think.
How do you know you know? How do you know you know? What? I remember this part. It is funny. He's so funny.
I love that he threw LSD and women's intuition as above reason.
It's great. Like, he's hilarious. He's so serious too when he says it. Yeah, I read it.
So what the last question, this is a very much a microscopic type question. What does he mean? What is this question? What's outside of man's province of knowledge, like as a question of epistemology? What is that referring to?
Well, you could say what is within the realm of God and only God can know. I mean, that was the most obvious stuff. Like only he could know that.
Okay.
When the day you will die or whatever it might be. Or only God can know. Well, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Do you think this is the way I copied this pretty much word for word as he said it. Do you think this is a pretty accurate sketch of the historical development of these questions within epistemology? Because he does get to faith, revelation, LSD, and then outside of his province of knowledge at the end.
I think he's just giving a general picture.
Yeah. Yep.